As March 1945 drew to a close, the Axis powers were on the cusp of capitulation in the Second World War. Soviet forces had reached the Oder River to the east, while from the west, the American military was nearing the Elbe River. Situated between these two waterways lay Berlin, the nucleus of the Third Reich and the Nazi German Empire. The city's fall could potentially signal the end of the European conflict. The first to secure Berlin would not only be credited with the downfall of the Nazis, but would also reap considerable spoils. Paramount among these were the German scientists engaged in Hitler's nuclear initiatives and advanced armaments research. The prospect of seizing these individuals and their designs was a coveted goal for both the Soviet Union and the United States, setting the stage for a fierce competition to occupy Berlin. However, the narrative took an unexpected turn when the United States withdrew from this contest. American military leaders, recognizing the potential loss of 100,000 soldiers to take Berlin, deemed the cost prohibitive and ceded the task to the Soviets. General Eisenhower, the American commander, dispatched a telegram to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, apprising him of the shift in U.S. strategy. The Americans would not extend their advance beyond the Elbe's western banks. Stalin subsequently orchestrated a decisive assault on Berlin, ushering in what would be the final major engagement of the war in Europe, the Battle of Berlin. The Soviet forces, with approximately 2.5 million troops, a fleet of over 6,000 tanks, and a formidable arsenal of Katyusha rockets, some with ranges exceeding 8 kilometers, held a significant advantage. These rockets, notably utilized by the Lebanese Hezbollah, were a source of dread for the German troops. In stark contrast, the German forces stretched from the Oder to Berlin totaled only 766,000, with 300,000 stationed in Berlin itself and the remainder positioned along the Oder. The Germans could muster a mere 800 tanks, faced with severe fuel shortages that crippled both their armored divisions and air force. Conversely, the Soviet military suffered no such logistical impediments. Their tanks were fully operational, supported by air superiority from thousands of aircraft and a substantial stockpile of ammunition. Compounding the Germans' woes was a dearth of veteran soldiers. Many had perished in previous battles, leaving the ranks filled with unseasoned youths and hastily drafted members from the army, police, the Luftwaffe, the Waffen-SS, and other factions. Additionally, the Volkssturm, a militia composed of novices to warfare and foreign volunteers, Norwegians, French, and other Europeans fearful of a post-war communist dominion, swelled the German numbers but could not offset the manpower deficit. Leadership crises also plagued the German side. Adolf Hitler's strategic acumen had waned following a string of defeats. His belief that the Soviets would either bypass Berlin or falter in urban warfare, as the Nazis had in Stalingrad, was misguided. His overconfidence led to a refusal to reinforce Berlin, opting instead to deploy units to other fronts, such as Czechoslovakia or Hungary. This faith in the Berlin garrison was misplaced, contributing to the strategic missteps that hastened the end of the war. Every soldier stood resolute, prepared to fight to the death. An army that, under different circumstances, might have been sufficient to defend the city. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet onslaught on Berlin commenced, marking the start of a historic yet devastatingly brutal conflict. The Soviet forces assaulting Berlin were bifurcated into two principal contingents. The first was under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's preferred general, lauded for his pivotal role in the defense of Moscow in 1941 and the momentous victory at Stalingrad. His leadership had garnered immense popularity, second only to Stalin among the Russian populace. Zhukov was intent on adding the conquest of the Nazi stronghold to his accolades, a distinction Stalin had reserved for him alone, elevating his status over his peers. Yet within the Soviet ranks, there existed a potent rivalry. Zhukov's counterpart, General Ivan Konev. Stationed at the Nysa River, the southern branch of the Oder, Konev commanded the forces on Zhukov's southern flank. Stalin, in his strategic maneuvering, incited a covert race to Berlin by instructing both generals to launch their offensives concurrently. On the 16th of April, General Zhukov's forces breached the Oder and engaged in fierce combat against the entrenched German defenses. The initial foray was met with formidable resistance at the Seelow Heights, a critical gateway to Berlin from the east. The German forces, entrenched upon this elevation, unleashed a devastating barrage upon the exposed Soviet tanks advancing across the plains below. The intensity of the German counterattack nearly drove the Soviets back, but the Soviet military doctrine was notoriously indifferent to casualties. Victory was the singular objective, irrespective of the human toll. Soviet tactics often involved sacrificing lesser-regarded units to preserve their more elite forces and vital equipment. Convicts from the penal battalions were propelled forward into minefields, tasked with their perilous clearance to safeguard the advancing tanks, a brutal strategy that bore the cost of innumerable lives. General Zhukov employed such ruthless methods at the Seelow Heights, and after a grievous loss of 30,000 soldiers, managed to break through the German defenses. Nevertheless, this victory came at the cost of valuable time, placing him at a disadvantage in the race to Berlin. Concurrently, General Konev, having forded the Nysa River, was carving a path of overwhelming force through German resistance to the southern outskirts of Berlin. With the city's defenses exposed to his formidable tank divisions, Konev was poised to etch his name in history by winning the race to Berlin. Yet, in an ironic twist of fate, Stalin's directive halted Konev's advance. The honor of capturing Berlin had been unequivocally assigned to Zhukov, forcing Konev to relinquish his imminent triumph to his adversary, a decision he accepted without contest, aware of Stalin's unforgiving nature towards dissent. Thus, Konev's tanks idled at Berlin's southern boundary, while from the east and north, Zhukov's forces initiated their assault on the city. Amidst these tumultuous battles, April 20th approached, the anniversary of Hitler's birth. The Battle of Berlin was reaching its zenith. The combined forces of the Soviet Union and the Allies were converging on a city that symbolized the heart of Nazi Germany. The relentless pounding of Russian artillery and the bombing runs by American aircraft, poignantly timed on Hitler's birthday, laid waste to structures that once stood as monuments to the Third Reich's ambition. As the encirclement of Berlin tightened, the grim reality within the city contrasted sharply with the propaganda of the regime. The desperation of the Nazi leadership was evident in their flight from the city, leaving behind a vastly outnumbered force to face the Soviet juggernaut. Among them were not just soldiers, but civilians and even children, pressed into the last-ditch defense of a doomed city. Hitler's last public appearance betrayed the decline of both the man and his regime. The iron grip he once had on Germany was reduced to a trembling salute, a frail figure among the ruins of his own making. It is widely believed that Hitler's narcotic use had increased under the stress of the war, leading to his deteriorated physical condition. Such details often emerge in the historical retrospectives and biographies of dictators, highlighting their personal weaknesses amidst the catastrophic consequences of their rule. As the siege tightened, Hitler's scorched earth directive, his Nero decree, revealed his willingness to sacrifice Germany itself rather than concede defeat, a testament to the fanaticism that drove the Nazi regime. The consequences for the civilians remaining in Berlin were catastrophic, as they faced the violence of the final assault and the breakdown of the city's infrastructure without access to basic necessities. Despite the hopeless situation, the German defense was tenacious. Nazi propaganda had instilled a fierce, almost suicidal resolve in its fighters, and the city was converted into a fortress, bristling with ad hoc defenses. Key strategic locations, like the Reich Chancellery and the Reichstag, were heavily fortified against the inevitable Soviet assault. These structures represented not just strategic goals, but symbolic ones for both sides, prizes in a devastating urban battle that would mark the end of the war in Europe. The Soviets threw a massive force into the fray, yet not the entirety of their available army. The forces committed to the assault on Berlin itself were substantial. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and air support, all to overcome the final pocket of Nazi resistance. Within this cauldron, the fighting was fierce and brutal. German soldiers, many of them young boys and old men, alongside remnants of seasoned units, fought with the knowledge that surrender could mean death, or at the very least, the harsh mercy of Soviet capture. With little to no hope for victory, they fought on, firing Panzerfausts, simple but effective anti-tank weapons, against the Soviet armored divisions, causing significant damage and slowing the advance. As the Soviet army advanced block by block, the fate of Berlin was sealed, but the fighting would continue until the very last holdouts were silenced. The assault on the Reichstag was symbolic, charged with political as well as military significance. The building, once the seat of the Weimar Republic's democracy, had been a hollow icon since Hitler's rise to power. But it still stood as a potent symbol for both sides. For the Soviet forces, capturing the Reichstag meant toppling the very heart of the Nazi regime. For the German defenders, it was a final stand to protect the epicenter of their dwindling territory. The intense urban combat within Berlin is a stark representation of the brutality of World War II's concluding chapter in Europe. The Soviet troops employed ruthless efficiency and sheer force of numbers, while the German defenders, comprising both seasoned soldiers and hastily conscripted civilians, clung to their positions with a combination of fear, fanaticism, and fatalism. The German tactic of destroying buildings to create impassable debris was desperate but tactically sound, designed to impede the Soviet advance and inflict heavy tank losses. Both sides engaged in a type of warfare that was extraordinarily destructive. The Soviet strategy of demolishing buildings to clear defenders, then mopping up with infantry and flamethrowers, was a grim but effective means to advance through a city transformed into a fortress. The utilization of Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organ for their distinctive sound, added to the cacophony and devastation of the siege, turning parts of the city into a lunar landscape. The use of the city's existing infrastructure, like the subway tunnels and sewer networks, by the Soviets was another example of their ability to adapt and overcome urban obstacles. Their ability to bypass barricaded streets and emerge behind German lines or within contested buildings provided them with tactical advantages, although at great risk to the soldiers involved in such subterranean fighting. The eventual encirclement of the city with the sealing of western exits by Soviet forces ensured the complete isolation of the Nazi leadership. The shrinking German-held pocket, with ammunition running low and the relentless Soviet advance, spelled the end for the Nazi defense of Berlin. Hitler, deep within his bunker, faced the inevitable. The suggestion by General Weidling to break out and continue the fight to the west was a realistic assessment of the tactical situation, but politically impossible for Hitler, who was by then resigned to die in Berlin. The battle for the Reichstag became a microcosm of the larger battle for Berlin. Fierce German resistance continued as Soviet soldiers fought their way through the building. The race to raise the Soviet flag over the Reichstag was not just a personal achievement for the soldiers involved, but a historic moment signaling the fall of the Third Reich. Meanwhile, Hitler's final days in the bunker, as Soviet forces inched closer, were marked by a combination of denial, delusion, and the last vestiges of his authoritarian command, soon to be extinguished in the flames of Berlin and the broader conflagration he had ignited across Europe. In a robust counteroffensive, Russian forces bombarded the edifice with an onslaught of tank and artillery fire. After a relentless 10-hour siege, the stronghold succumbed to Russian control. On the night of April 30th, precisely at 10:50 p.m., the soldiers of the Russian 756th Rifle Regiment ceremoniously unfurled their standard. The iconic red banner, adorned with the hammer and sickle, was elevated, signaling their triumph. In a display of euphoria, the Russian soldiers discharged their weapons skyward, a declarative gesture to the encircled German forces that capitulation was their only recourse. As the Soviet ensign dominated the skyline above the German Reichstag the following day, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, his consort, chose self-inflicted death over capitulation. In the aftermath, their remains were promptly located by the Russian military. Subsequent to Hitler's demise on May 1st, a relentless salvo from the Russian arsenal descended upon the Chancellery and the residual Nazi bastions. What followed was an unrivaled fusillade that battered the German defenses. On May 2nd, in the wake of this relentless shelling, the Nazi military governor of Berlin, General Helmuth Weidling, capitulated. In a solemn procession, legions of German soldiers emerged, yielding to the Russian forces. Yet, confrontations persisted beyond Berlin's boundaries, with additional German contingents surrendering in the ensuing days. On May 7th, the Germans proffered their surrender to the US and Allied forces in France, and on the subsequent day in Berlin, to the Russian forces, signaling the cessation of a conflict initiated by the German Reich. The Battle of Berlin exacted a grievous toll, claiming the lives or causing injuries to over 300,000 Russian soldiers within a mere 17 days. Russian records assert the fatalities of 458,000 German combatants and the demise of 125,000 civilians. Although the European theater of war drew to a close following the Battle of Berlin, conflict persisted in Asia. Japan, an ally of Germany, continued its military engagements within the Pacific until the devastating nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, respectively, in 1945. Japan's formal capitulation on September 2nd, 1945, marked the global cessation of the Second World War. In the post-war landscape, the Soviet Union sought the expertise of German nuclear physicists, commandeering no less than 200 to Soviet territories following Berlin's fall. Their knowledge was instrumental in the Soviet ascension to nuclear capability in 1949, positioning it as the world's second nuclear power after the United States. To my intellectually inclined audience, we have reached the conclusion of the second season in the Generals and Battles series. Fear not, for our exploration into military history is far from over. Upcoming seasons will delve into additional conflicts and chronicle the legacies of renowned military tacticians. Continue to engage with our series, enrich your knowledge, and support our efforts by subscribing and liking our content.